So paint for me a picture of some improvements that have occurred in your field during your career.
Well, I also spent 17 years as an intensive care unit attending at Tufts. And one of the things was that I had the privilege of putting the very first patient at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, the very first infant, on intermittent mechanical ventilation, because my senior resident, who was going into neonatology, read up on it and decided this is what this kid needed. In terms of cystic fibrosis, when I was an intern in 1974, the 50% expected survival was 16 years. We had almost no therapy. There were no oral drugs for Pseudomonas. We had carbenicillin and gentamicin. Those were the only two intravenous medications, and didn't matter what the sensitivities were, that's all you had to use. We used chloramphenicol like it was water, because that was an indication for the use of chloramphenicol was an exacerbation in CF. And also we had pancreatic enzymes, which were very poorly absorbed in gastric acidity, but we had nothing to suppress gastric acidity except sodium bicarbonate, and we threw an awful lot of borderline patients into congestive heart failure with that. So when I look back and when I give the basic lectures on CF to the residents and medical students, and I talk about what we had back then, we literally had nothing. And the survival statistics showed it. There was a very interesting thing that occurred early on. Around 1981-82, the 50% expected survival for CF patients had increased from 16 years to 21 years in North America, all over, except in Toronto, where it was 27 years. Now, we didn't think the Toronto doctors were better than we were. We didn't even think they were better hockey players than we were. But there was something going on. One of our Mass Medical Society members, who's in private practice in Fitchburg, Dr. John McLaughlin. John had finished his fellowship with us in pulmonary medicine and went up to Toronto Sick Children's as an attending physician. And so he sat down with the people there to compare what we did in Boston versus what did there, and found that there was almost no difference between the care in Boston and the care in Toronto, except for one thing. Harry Schwachman had us putting all of our patients on what he called high-calorie, low-fat diets. He said they can't absorb the long-chain fats very well, so let's avoid them, and we'll use medium-chain triglyceride oil for their salad dressing and for fried chicken. You can make prisoners of war talk with that stuff, and it was $32 a quart back in 1977. In Toronto, they said, eat what you want. If a particular food you can't digest, don't eat it. So maybe they couldn't handle a couple of hot dogs, but they did okay with a slice of pizza. Maybe they couldn't do pizza, but some peanut butter was okay. Their diets were far more palatable. Their BMIs were more normal, and their survival was greater. 7 years longer.
Isn't that interesting?
It was very humbling. But we immediately changed our approach to nutrition in the rest of Canada and the United States, and the 50% survival had gotten up into the 30s, high 30s, before the modern era of new therapies. But the most recent major things that have occurred in cystic fibrosis have been the advent of small molecules to correct the basic defect, which is a transmembrane chloride channel conductance regulator. The story is very interesting because what happened back when I was an undergraduate in the College of Engineering at Lehigh University, I was in engineering chemistry. People from industry, the pharmaceutical industry, would come by every couple of years and say, do you have any interesting compounds your students have made? Can we have some samples? We'll take them back, see if they're any good for anything. And this was very hit or miss and didn't really do a lot. The CF Foundation became aware of a concept called robotic screening, which was being done by Aurora Pharmaceuticals and several other places. Aurora was in San Diego. They decided they wanted to get into this, but they certainly needed funds to do it. Bonnie Ramsey, who had been a resident at Children's when I was a fellow. Bonnie was now the CF Center Director in Seattle, and her husband was the Dean of Medicine at the medical school. So they went to visit a local philanthropist by the name of Bill Gates, and brought the CF Foundation seniors with them, who explained what they wanted to do. And Mr. and Mrs. Gates thanked them, and they left. A week later, one of the secretaries in the CF Foundation in Bethesda was opening up the mail, 34-cent stamp envelope, and a handwritten check for $20 million fell out in her lap. She screamed, everybody gathered around, someone said, was it safe to send it through the mail like that? Someone else said, you're going to fence that check? They took that $20 million and another $20 million they had, and Dr. Vicky Sato, who was the president the CEO at Vertex at the time, and who was a good friend. They worked with the people to come up with high throughput screening and found a couple of molecules that seemed to have an effect on chloride channel function. And through combinatorial chemistry, they came up with some molecules that then went into clinical trials. And I've been fortunate enough to take part in all those clinical trials, not just for that company, Vertex, but for many others. Those have led to Kalydeco, Symdeko, Orkambi, Symdeko. These are specific drugs which alter the effect of the chloride channel, and we have seen a dramatic improvement. The 50% expected survival in cystic fibrosis now is in the high 40s, approaching 50. And there are many new drugs that are in the pipeline. So that we've gone from a survival, 50% expected survival for a newborn with cystic fibrosis in 1974 of 16 years to almost 50 years for a newborn born today with cystic fibrosis. And we fully expect to see that we will get patients eventually to what can be considered a normal lifespan with a disease that was once, there's an old German proverb, I won't bore you with my college German, but it basically said, the child will soon die who tastes salty when kissed. And it was known many years ago that these patients had excess salt in their sweat because of the chloride transport defect. And we have turned that around. If you're lucky in medicine, during your lifetime you get involved with a disease for which there's very little therapy and hope, and spend your career working on the development of new therapies until it becomes something.
It'd be very satisfying.
That's satisfying.
So you went from a phase in which you were basically treating the symptoms and the complications to actually getting at the physiology or pathology of the disease.
Absolutely.
And working on it. And you did this in an academic environment in which you were both working on research as well as working with clinical care. Specifically with cystic fibrosis, but also in the intensive care unit. In a typical day or a typical week, how do you divide that up? How does it work?
There's no typical week. I mean, basically, everything changes. Back when I first started at Tufts, when I was the entire division, I was on call every night and every weekend. About every 6 weeks, Dave Fulton from cardiology or Cody Meissner from ID would take first call from me. I did that for 3 years. Somehow the patient survived, I survived, and then I hired Dr. Bill Yee joined me from Scarpelli's group in New York, and that's when we took over 6 months of running the ICU. So, you know, at any one time you could be the ICU attending, the pulmonary unit attending, and being in clinic seeing patients. I cannot imagine trying to do that today, but back in the early 1980s, that's what we did. And now, having cut back to half-time, I'm in the clinical research unit, or we also see our research patients in the clinical unit. And I'll see a number of patients each week on one of the 40 different research protocols we have going, not just in cystic fibrosis. We've branched out. We have some of our research group that are very interested in interstitial lung disease in children, primary ciliary dyskinesia, aspects of asthma. Our new division chief, Benji Raby, who came over from the Brigham, his area of expertise is in genome-wide association studies. And so we're branching out to clinical trials in other than just cystic fibrosis. And this is the way to get new therapies to patients even before they are actually finally approved by the FDA.
Right.
And this has been very important. There are some patients who have had what can only be called dramatic turnarounds in their disease on the basis of their being on these new therapies. Other things that I'm doing, in 2018, I became an associate editor of the journal Pediatric Pulmonology. So I get a large number of manuscripts to look at and find specific reviewers and work on that. I'm the chair of the Professional Education Committee for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which I've been since 1995. And that's another thing that I've been pleased with, because when I took over the committee, we had 4 applicants for pulmonary fellowships in the United States, which was not enough to sustain what we need for the CF centers around the country.
Sure.
And when I started talking, I talked to one of our residents who had, before medical school, been Jeff Drazen's lab technician for 5 years. I mean, I said, where am I writing the letters? This is when I was at Tufts, we didn't have a fellowship program. I said, where am I writing your letters of recommendation? This would have been around 1985 or 6. He said, thanks for the vote of confidence, Hank, but I owe 75, Deborah owes 85. You know, we've got to go into practice and pay this off.
Sure.
So I went to the CF Foundation and I said, I want you to do something. I want you to pay a certain amount of money to cover the debt interest while people are fellows. Don't pay the principal, but I want you to pay the interest so that the debt doesn't accumulate while they're in their fellowship training. Foundation agreed to pay up to $7,000 a year per person. That's $21,000 over 3 years of a pulmonary fellowship.
Yeah.
And this past year, my committee had 30 applicants for a fellowship, and I've just finished with a working task group at the CF Foundation that has made recommendations to the senior administration there to significantly increase the financial support, because the debts are so much higher. We here at the Medical Society give 4 $10,000 scholarships per year to each of the 4 medical schools, and $1,000 for 4 runner-ups to each of the 4 medical schools.
Sure.
Because when you interview these people, first of all, they're not only incredibly qualified, but they have accomplished far more than I certainly accomplished when I was in medical school.
Right.
And you look at their debts, and the lowest debt that I saw was $232,000, and some were in the low 400s.
Yeah.
If 2 of them get married, they owe $750,000.
Yeah.
You try to get a loan to buy a house, let alone a loan to start a practice. It's impossible. So we have to do something about that debt. And I'm pleased to say the CF Foundation is looking very favorably at doing something. That's a niche. That's just for the people that do pulmonary, GI, genetics, ID for cystic fibrosis.
Sure.
But we have to do this and expand this so that it's something like this is available to all medical students.
So we're getting back towards residency and the like. That's coming into our conversation. And how was life during your residency?
It was a very different world. Some of the things that were outlined as character building back in 1974 when I started my internship would be reportable to the chairman of the Department of Medicine and probably result in the serious reprimand to the faculty member or resident that did the same thing. On my first day, I remember my first day on the wards, because I started in the emergency room and then was farmed out to one of our outlying nurseries. But first of September in 74, I remember coming on the ward, and my senior resident, who was considerably shorter than I was, grabbed me by my white jacket and pulled my head down level with his and said, "Dorkin, we'll get along fine as long as you realize one thing. I don't like surprises. Don't ever surprise me on rounds. And may God have mercy on your soul if you ever surprise me in front of the chief resident on rounds. Have you got that clear? I said, yes. This guy had a marvelous sense of humor. We had no on-call room, so I lay down the first night I was on call on the treatment table, which was the only place to lie down, and wearing my white uniform. And I woke up the next morning to find a completely filled out morgue tag attached to my whites. But I did learn not to surprise the physician in question. And also, if you can believe it, a pediatric internship class of 20 interns, only 2 women and 18 guys. We were probably the last of the every other night pediatric residency programs in the country, which eventually the chairman made every 3rd night, even though we voted it down 3 times to go from every other to every 3rd. We voted it down. He finally said, I'm the chief. I can't recruit house staff to come here. You're now every 3rd night. But it was a camaraderie. It was total immersion. It was the Berlitz method of medical education. You lived, I mean, almost nobody was married. Only one person had children. And you basically lived across the street from the hospital and were there
right
all the time.
It was your life.
And that was, I found that was a way for me to learn.
Yeah.
Because you just were involved with everything that was going on. It's a different world now.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that what we had then would be operable or translate to the current day. But I must say I wouldn't trade what I went through for anything, because it showed me what I could handle. And it showed me what I needed to be able to handle things. And later on, when I was all alone as a faculty member at Tufts, on every night and every weekend, wasn't that different from being a house
felt
officer.
familiar. Okay. And with regard to just going into medicine, you talked about your dad's practice and everything, and so I imagine that as you're growing up, you're getting a certain perspective regarding medicine, and that led you in that direction. What sorts of things influenced you?
Dad was something else. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa AOA from Johns Hopkins at the age of 23. This was 1944. There was a war on, so he and Denton Cooley and Les Persky and the rest of their group went through medical school in 2 years and 11 months. But he was a diagnostician's diagnostician, and his patients loved him. He gave them all the time in the world. He knew everything about them. After he died, I remember one of his patients, who was actually my age, told me that my father had actually paid for her and her sister to go to summer camp one year because he saw that their mother was just totally exhausted, and they couldn't afford something like that. This was inner city Camden, New Jersey, and Dad thought this was the best thing to treat the whole family, was to give the kids the experience and to give Mom a respite.
Sure.
And he did things like this, and you didn't hear about it.
Right.
He truly, I never, as naive as one can be. In the 7th grade, I had notebooks that said Lehigh University 1970, Johns Hopkins 1974. I didn't know what it was like to try to get into those places and graduate, but I just was going to do literally everything that he had done.
Yeah.
And so I was the 3rd generation to go to Lehigh. My son went to Swarthmore. I can't argue. And Dad, I followed in his footsteps in Baltimore. I have always been grateful that I had that opportunity.
Yeah, what a wonderful choice. So we've covered an awful lot today. We've gone over your years as an officer in the Medical Society and the issues you faced there regarding assisted suicide or whatever it's being called, and with regard to opioid abuse and injection facilities and a lot of other issues regarding EHR interoperability. We've gone over your practice and all of the work that you've done and improvement you've seen in cystic fibrosis, your education and the intensity, the immersion method, as you called it, as well as your choice for medicine. Are there any other things that you'd like to cover today during this interview?
Yeah. I was very fortunate that my wife supported me through all of this. Kathy actually is the smart one of the two. She got her degree she soloed with the Philly Orchestra at the age of 17. She got her degree in theoretical math from Radcliffe College, Harvard University at the age of 20. She spent 4 years after Harvard at the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, was principal harp on the nationwide tour of the Pennsylvania Ballet Company. She was substitute principal harp with the Philadelphia Orchestra when the principal harp was injured. When we were trying to buy a house and didn't have much money as a brand new assistant professor at Tufts, she said, okay, I'll write a grant and get it funded, and we'll use that for the down payment. So she wrote a Bunting Institute grant at Harvard, got it funded, and that was the bulk of our down payment. She is far smarter than I am. And together we have 2 children who are certainly smarter than their father. Molly, who has her PhD in art history from Cambridge University in the United Kingdom, and Robert, who has his PhD in molecular biology from MIT and is a senior research scientist with Beam Therapeutics here in Kendall Square.
Wow.
I work hard to try to keep up with the rest of the family. But they have supported me every step of the way. You cannot do this unless you have your family's love and support, and I was fortunate enough to have that.
What a great note to end on. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you very much for having me.